what I'm trying to do anyway is to have people recognize what a profound difference it is when you're training the brain as opposed to not training the brain. When you're just trying to work with the mind, and I'm just trying to unfold the story. I mean, this is 1/3 the length of anything I've written, maybe 1/10 of what I've written. Trying to condense it is still long, but trying to condense it into a true form without the need for making it shorter, overtaking the reality of what happened. And in fact, in a certain way, the long reality of what happened. One of the things that I think is unexplainable was that I kept getting hit. You know, I didn't always keep established the progress that I had made when some other horror would come up. And all I know is that that's the way it was for me. In a way, I guess it's a brain-mind free-for-all, where the brain is trying to establish itself and the mind is so routinized in the horror of it. David Kaiser, a fellow neurofeedback person who's a little wild himself and also very brilliant, said that it was addiction, that you were addicted to states. And I think there's some truth in that. I think it's the wrong language because it's got its own connotations. But I do think there's some truth in that, that it's a very powerful thing to overcome what the brain has been relying on.
That's so interesting to hear you say that, because this was a sense that I had several days ago as I was listening. I was like, this feels so resonant and familiar to me. And, you know, as you know, I'm a recovering addict, and I spent many years doing all kinds of different substances. And there was parts of the book where it just seemed to me really like it really felt it felt resonant, this idea of, you know, going to and pulling away and going to and pulling away. That's something that feels really familiar to me, this idea of like, I hate this, I can't stand this, I need this, I can't be without it. That whole sort of limbic, you know, being vulnerable to just some being possessed finally in some kind of way by something that is beyond personal control, and just longing for some sense of like stability and grounding and placement.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think unlike that experience, the quote addiction, the need was for the object, and that's health. So to abandon that and to call it addiction is a problem for that
Mhm.
reason, because it is actually a healthy striving that I can't quite trust, that I can't quite understand, that is mixed up, as you will discover as you go on, with terrifying events and who my first object was. This all becomes clear why I would react this way, but that's the entire therapy.
Mhm.
And so, in that sense, not, um, although, you may have chosen and others choose drugs to fill that up, right? I didn't choose drugs to fill that up.
Right.
I tried to choose a person and he offered himself to me. I mean, he made himself available to me. I saw him 4 times a week sometimes. And I lived for those appointments. Just that is so much like if I were addicted to heroin, I
Yeah.
would live for those moments. But it was human to human. I didn't just, I was looking for a mother,
Right.
period, period. And maybe that's what all addiction is. I don't know. I mean, that's a whole thing to
Yeah,
explore,
that's
but
all. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't, uh, I don't want to reduce the conversation to addiction, because it's not the model I end up preferring. Yeah.
Right. So when you say object, I think that can be confusing. It's certainly confusing for me, because as I hear you talking about it, it sounds like you're referring to the sort of relational, the attachment between people, in your case, as I've read already, so far, like it's really about motherlessness, and it's the absence of that attachment really is the core piece of it. What I understand you describing is that the trauma and other things that led, the sort of layers of trauma that happen on top of that, they are rooted in this absence, in this missing attachment.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think well-attached children ever end up in a hospital or ever end up in this kind of therapeutic bind, because there's no need for it. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that you can try to address this by somehow reliving, replanting, re-engaging with these maternal longings, but they're never going to get met because they're infant and there's no way to meet them, which I didn't know, because I kept striving for that with him. Not intellectually, core, give me life, give me death, striving. The only way that you can end up getting a second chance at the regulation that good enough mothering gives you, which is now all we can offer, but it's a lot. And that's neurofeedback. And then I think DBR, but in a different way, right? I think it's fundamentally neurofeedback, saying to the brain, helping the brain say, this is how you would feel if your mother was holding you. And you don't even make that translation, but the brain does it.
The brain does.
Yeah.
Interesting. So over a period of time, and of course the details are important, like based on like what placements you're doing, what frequencies you're starting with. Over a period of time, then your brain moves to a sense of greater self-regulation. Am I getting that right?
That's true, but it happens almost overnight. It's not a long time. To overtake the terror that it was going to disappear, or that it wasn't real, or anything that my cognitive mind would do with it, took a lot longer.
There's numerous things that sort of stopped me as I was reading it, and one of the things that and I've forgotten this in myself. There's a moment when you say, I want you to feel the level of pain and just the nightmarish reality that I go through. Not for a long time, you clarify. I just want you to feel for a second what it's like for me. And it just brought back with a flash the pain that I was in for a period of time. And for me, it was, 20s and early 30s or whatever. And eventually, and that's what led to the addiction for me. For me, there was a process, and it's not really relevant to the conversation, that I went through to eventually get to a point where I don't feel that level of just, pain and havoc and whatever on a daily basis. But it occurred to me to wonder how much pain do you feel today? Like, how much is that sort of limbic reaction, that how much does that play a role, or is it largely behind you now? Can you bring the good news that over a period of time it's possible to actually come out of the kind of chaos and agony that you describe?
I feel none of it. I feel none of that chaos. And I think it's possible that part of the process was that every time I would begin to lose the familiar landscape of chaos, along with whatever else I was losing, and gaining in terms of experience and landscapes and worlds, right? Whole atmospheres of trauma, no trauma, that is an incredibly confusing matrix to move through. And that a lot of the process of the therapy and the neurofeedback together is negotiating all of that. It's also the fact that neurofeedback not only quieted this for me, but it also brought me new awareness that does happen in neurofeedback with trauma survivors. Yeah, it's not just that you are quieted and comforted, you are confronted, and that goes on in the book too. It's not just one thing that happens with neurofeedback, particularly at the level of traumatic experience that I had endured before any sort of, even in a normal brain, there's not going to be much of a default mode network, right? And who knows what's happened to the default mode network, the sense of self network in the brain when there's no mother in the picture. So it's not like a simple course. And I found that to be true with others too. But at this point, even when I entered DBR, which is it's the next book, but it's also the truth of my experience now. As I entered DBR, I did it as an exploration because I don't sleep well. And neurofeedback has never brought back sleep. So I thought I could do this simple thing. All of this is just, a little bit naive. But I think this whole book is going to present to people who are really interested in trauma a whole lot of questions, that they have to answer. But anyway, I went into it well. I was happy. I was productive. I did all this stuff with when I started doing my DBR, along with neurofeedback, because I kept, I have a lot of problems, a lot of head injury, and so I've had concussions, and now I've had a stroke, and I've had a lot of impacts to my brain. So that would suggest that you're going to have, a much longer course as well. But it's really since doing a course of DBR as well as neurofeedback that I feel like, it's over, and in a way that momentarily anyway presented an extraordinary identity crisis. Who are you?
Right.
I've lived my whole life with this.
Yeah, there's a whole section where Arles is clearly very concerned. There are no such thing as accidents in your life. You go through the long list of hospitalizations and the various treatments, as they call them, which end up feeling like, to somebody who has studied a lot of this stuff, like it's a self part of the abusive way that people address people who are severely dysregulated. If you present in a severely dysregulated way, you are vulnerable to the excess of the hospital industry. And they have their own description of what's wrong with you and what they're going to do to you. That doesn't seem to be abating very much. It seems to be very much in the wings, the beginning conversation, which I hope that this book will help to raise more awareness about. And one thing that I thought about is because you talk also about the meditation. There's a whole section in there about you going to start by meeting 𝘠𝘮. And it made me think of the number of people who have really severe reactions to meditation, and made me wonder, like, what drew. You said that it was the photo of Thich Nhat Hanh that originally inspired you to go to that. And I wondered then, there's a question about what is it that causes people who meditate a lot to have these kinds of things, and I think there's some way in which this journal sort of walks along what's happening there, right? I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
No, I have some thoughts about it. I don't know how much I addressed it because I don't know how much I thought about it in this particular phase or moment. Not when I went, for sure. I was scared, but I wasn't. There's a second time that I go, and there's a little bit more of the affect because I'm leaving Arles. And it's the leaving Arles that creates the huge havoc in my system. All of these things were very hard to acknowledge in myself, but I had to. Anyway, I think what happens, and places like Plum Village and other retreat centers talk about this. I mean, it's grounds for dismissal from a retreat if you stop taking your psychiatric meds, because they don't want people to try to rely on the process of meditation. And partly that is, although not articulated as this, and it may not be right, but my sense is that one of what we're trying to do with neurofeedback is to establish the default mode network, the sense of self network, and all the things that we do. That's either the direct thing that we're trying to do, or we're hoping that it comes from regulation. Okay. So what happens with successful meditation is that the default mode network, which is an iffy proposition for people like me, was an iffy proposition, goes down. If you have a moment of good meditation, the default mode network goes down. It's not active anymore. Now, this is a eureka moment for an experienced meditator, because they get a glimpse, and it doesn't last for very long, of no self. But you're not an experienced meditator. You are a hanging on by your fingernails, affect dysregulated human being, and suddenly, who has no self anyway. It's a very perilous sense of self because there's been no mother. And suddenly the structure has disappeared completely. And there's a breakdown. And retreat centers work with a lot of people who are having major breakdowns, and they don't want to. That's not, I mean, there are spiritual crisis centers and things like that who are places like that will specialize in that. But what we're trying to do is the opposite of dropping away the sense of self. We're trying to gain it. And in fact, that's one of the intriguing things theoretically, on a theory basis, that sends me to meditation, is that that I have spent all of this time in theory and training and everything about how important it is to have a sense of self. And then I'm told by my Buddhist friends that there is a sense of self. So, okay, I have to look into this. And I didn't, but as I write in the book, my meditations terrible. I mean, you know, I don't know how to meditate. I think when I'm leaving Plum Village the first time that I'll have to practice breathing for a year. Well, you know, that's the primary mode of work that I still do. So, and you know, keep in mind that I'm speculating on what
Sure.
I think happens, but that would be as good an explanation as I think there, you know, we have at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so there's the question of like, why were you inspired to seek meditation besides that you just were overcome by the look of this person that you saw a photograph of and the interesting interactions that you had with him when you went to Plum Village or when you met Thich Nhat Hanh the first time. But it also brings up this question of what is, you know, there's this dynamic that's happening where you have gone to, you know, you've followed that direction of physician heal thyself or whatever, right? Where like you're drawn to work with people who have experienced some of the, so you know, or approaching life with the same difficulties that you are approaching life with, even while you're in. Yeah, it's not like you healed and then you went back and went and showed everybody. You talk in the book of how you're actually working at the residential center, and you know the young woman burns the place down in part of the difficulty, and this is simultaneously you're going through your own hell, walking through that, and so you know I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, from the perspective of today, many years down the road, what was it like for you to be in this state? Like, I mean, you know, this sense that I think a lot of people who are approaching it, this is what I get from the journal, is this sense of just how much there is. How much can I pass finally? How much am I able to pass as just a regular person, as opposed to somebody who is struggling almost moment to moment just to be here? And that in some ways is this, like, you belong to the same continent as these folks that are in the residential treatment center, right? Like you recognize their approach. You talk about that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that feels like to be in that kind of world. You're sort of not seamlessly, but you're moving between the professional kind of thing where people say these horrendous things about, you know, so you talk about some of the other professionals in the treatment center who say things that are just clearly don't really understand what their population is addressing. Um, yeah.
The way that I think to approach this question, Lars, is that we had these huge books that were required by the licensing board to keep records in. And when they came to review for our license, and we were meeting with them, they commented on my records. And they said they were nearly illegible. And I had to shape it up and get better handwriting. Okay. You imagine me, I'm leaving a session. I have to get this written down in this big book in the room next door. And on some cases, I don't know how often, because I didn't recognize it was happening until many years later, and went back and looked and I saw it. My handwriting would shift from forward slant to back slant. This is a neurological indicator of DID, right? Of dissociative identity disorder. Now, I would assume, but I don't know this for sure, that this would happen after I had a session with a DID patient. But walking from the session where they would, by and large, feel quite understood, although I'd never talk about I didn't really know my own history. So, that's part of it. It's not like I was passing, that I had a history that I knew and I got by on people. I didn't have any clue of that. I would have desperate moments that I'd have to get through, but those would become a world to themselves. I wouldn't think about I'm missing a call from somebody else. I wouldn't miss the call from somebody. I'd take the call from somebody else and I would organize to meet that call. That may be, I mean, I don't know really if I was DID, but if I had been, that would have been where that was called into as a strength, right? That I could move into a personality, as it were, that could handle all of this bureaucracy. And then there was a part that would try to write the notes and couldn't keep, and I didn't even know was moving from a forward slant to a back slant. And then I would be criticized for how bad my handwriting was. So it wasn't great anyway, but you add that into it, and they really had to end up accepting it because I couldn't do much to change that. And so I guess that there's a way that I was in agony most of the time. And when I was asked to perform my job, my brain organized in a different way. And I was given awards for my work there. And during almost all of it, not all of it, but during most of it, I was going through a therapy that was extraordinarily demanding. And I mean, the other thing about that is that somehow it was either waiting for a phone call from him or in the sessions where I had the most difficulty. And the rest of the time I lived in a professional world. So it wasn't masking, really. It wasn't falsifying anything. It was just living in the section of myself that I had to, that the circumstances demanded. Because there's no core self, there's no core self who's organizing all this, right? There's no core self that feels like, well, now I have to do, I'm not my core self anymore. Well, I never was.
Right.
Until much later.
Yeah, it's interesting knowing a little bit about what comes out for you, what comes up as far as your history later on. Even as I'm reading the journal entries, there's one moment where there's someone whose dad was convicted of serial assault, and it was, you write about how disturbing this whole, like, not even knowing, not really being here or there with respect to, like, there not being enough for you to even know what you felt about being, like, you just went to the court to be present, presumably for your client, but not really having a sense of what that was. And at one moment, the therapist you're working with says, what is the thing that really disturbs you about this, or something along those lines? And it's almost like you're taken by surprise by the question, and then you describe being in kind of this chaotic netherworld for a couple of days without being able to actually have a narrative about what it is that's so dysregulating about the court.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a aspect of all of this that I underplay purposely in the book because I'm protecting patients of mine.
sure.
Their lives were so much the hell realm, particularly that patient, but others too. And she was incredibly bright and had survived. I mean, I don't know if I wrote about this, but she would stake out fancy houses and watch to see when the parents left to go to work, and then she'd go break into the house, where often they leave the door open and play with the toys that their children had because she didn't have any. She was homeless. She lived in a homeless shelter at best, and with her abusive father, and she and would make peanut butter sandwiches for herself in those houses. I didn't. My life was not one of deprivation. Mine was not even a life of neglect in a way, and that's what I come to understand better later on. My parents were absent, but they didn't neglect me. They were profoundly not there, but Christmas presents were, and dinner was on time. So that was confusing too, because I didn't even have the concept of absence until I started working with DBR.
Mhm.
And I push back against the idea of neglect quite a bit because most of my patients, not the one we're talking about, she was severely neglected. I don't even talk about the things that happened to her because they're too horrifying. I don't want to take a reader through it. It was hard enough for me to go through it. I don't even know how I did. There was probably more dissociation, so I think. But I stayed connected to her. And he'd been tried once before and been found not guilty. So we didn't know whether he was going to even be convicted. That was, yeah, he's probably out of jail now. I mean, it's just, I don't know if he survived because often child predators are murdered in prison. I don't know what happened to him. He was I can only begin to imagine what happened to him for him to do what he did. It's awful. But anyway, yeah, it would have been very hard for me because it would take a perspective that having a self would require having a self
Right.
to tell you what is this doing to me, and
Yeah.
yeah. And he would step in moments like that and just, remind me to do self-care stuff, but I don't know if that's there, but he would do that because I wouldn't know to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I remember from recent listening is that it's a lot about how your physical frame can't do any. You talk about like you can't be in an automobile accident because having, is it Sam, like talking about that you have shattered vertebrae and your spinal column maybe dissect. So there are all of these things, and it's clear that the therapist is trying to get you to see that, oh, I don't, I think there's one point where he says you're not allowed to go skiing. Yeah. And
Well, I think he says directly, you can't make these decisions. Your impulses make them, something like this, right?
right.
And so I'm going to make them for you and you're going to listen.
Yeah.
And, where does that happen in any therapy? And it was so vitally important, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that that came up for me is that I, at a much younger age, really longed for somebody to hold me accountable in a relational way. I would guess that there are a number of adults, people who've been through some kind of chaotic period, who are just longing for somebody who will do those two things. And it's not the model that we have really for almost, I mean, there are people who talk about the folks that have made a real difference in their lives, and they tend to be the folks who really go to bat for you and hold you accountable in a loving, attached kind of a way. And it's interesting to think about how, because at one point you describe how you're taking the things that you're learning from this challenging relationship that you have with this therapist, who seems to be, and you don't go into detail, it's not really, I suppose, relevant to the journal of what the actual process was that this therapist was doing with you. But it seems like you actually say as much, that you're taking the things that you're learning in that relationship to your professional work. And that's what you're doing the same thing for them that you feel like is being done for you in that relationship.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit, because we talk a little bit about like neurofeedback. There are ways of doing that thing, DBR, and I'm not trying to raise up some modality that we've never heard of, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that kind of accountable relational process was like. Like what were the things that you brought to your clients that you did not know to do before you started doing that therapy?
Well, as you suggest, it's almost a built-in hunger for that parental voice. And every child will need that voice somewhere along the way. If they have enough of it, they need it less, right? So it's safety. It's saying there's somebody bigger than you. It's somebody who sees what you're up to, who's been through this thing before, right? I mean, all those things that are so important to a child. And I was not a child, but I was a child. I was working with children who were children. They were young teenagers, most of them, hospitalized most of their lives, parentless, or with abusive parents, or abandoned parents who'd abandoned them, which may be the worst form of abuse. But I could just feel in some core visceral part of my being how protected I suddenly felt when he would take that kind of stance. I don't know if it came to him that way. It was just automatic. You're not going to go skiing. Listen to me. You are not going to go skiing. It's like, okay. I never did. I never did. I never went skiing after that. And it took that kind of authority and determination. I mean, he couldn't enforce that, but he enforced it. Our parents can't enforce it, but they enforce it because that's what they said to do or not to do. I didn't have them, right? Because they weren't there. So I figured, I mean, I don't even know if I had this, it just became, I felt it, it worked for me, it organized something in me. So I would, and it was a kind of personality that I have. I mean, I'm not a milk toast, so I could use it, right? It wasn't non-authentic or unauthentic or whatever the right word is
Yeah.
would be. It was authentic. And the responses that I would get, I mean, sometimes I get pushback and then I'd push back again, right? But often I got just such relief. And I quote one kid in there who said, "Nobody has ever done this for me before." Just essentially what you just said,
Mhm.
and she really appreciated it. Was at the end of her troubles? No, but there was a parent now, right? Or the facsimile of a parent close enough. And obviously she's in a residential treatment center, so there's a surround that's sort of kind of parental, was often not that, which was really a problem for me. I mean, it was a problem for all residential treatment, is that they don't know what to do with these kids that land there, and they try all kinds of models and stuff. It's just, they don't understand what they're doing, and often it's residential staff who've had worse parents than the kids have had, or I mean, one residential staff say to me, well, I turned out fine and my parents beat me. So oh,
Thanks.
or as I think is in the book, I found a bullet in the couch after a staff meeting. What? And I was not allowed to do anything.
Wow.
So this staff member stayed as a staff member because first of all, they can never replace him. It's impossible for the amount of money they pay to get anybody who is at all reasonable. Anyway, there are legions of difficulties
Right.
that neurofeedback could address, actually will address at some point, I think, in the not, hopefully I'll see some of it in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But that particular moment is organizing. It's neurologically organizing when a parental figure says no.
And one of the things that has struck me, my daughter is 8, and one of the things that I have discovered is that it's not enough to simply set the rules, to say this is what you're allowed to do and this is what you're not allowed to do. That can't be heard. The connection is absolutely pivotal. Like it doesn't, the whole thing actually, the joint is the connection, because if that part is not, it's not a critical, sorry, there's a noise here. I don't know what's happening in the next room. But yeah, the idea of actually making a connection with my daughter before I go to say what she's not allowed to do, that's the key thing. And this is something that I can immediately recognize, and it feels right, because breaking rules is what I did as a kid. Like that, you can have whatever rules you want. You can offer whatever consequence you want. That part doesn't frighten me. But if somebody is actually staking the relationship on this desire to see a different kind of outcome, that feels very, very different. And I wonder that, it makes me wonder about the electrical part of this whole, this relationship. What is actually happening there when two fields are happening and people are interacting based on the fact that I see you, I feel you. It's important to me that you do this kind of thing because I don't want things to happen to you because they will hurt me. And that is very different than just like, oh, I just, I know what the rules are. I know how to get around them.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. Yeah, I think it's an intriguing question and an important one, what's going on electrically. Because the whole conversation, the whole interpersonal, all the impersonal capacities are built on the organization of these electrical connections in the brain. And we're making those in utero. They're beginning when this child isn't yet a child breathing on her own. She's breathing in her mother's electrical system and her father's often as well. The system that we now know is primarily electrical, right? It's not all electrical, but it's primarily electrical. And so, yeah, it's an intriguing, I mean, in a way, all we're always saying is affect regulation is an electrical phenomenon, right? That we haven't traced that from the very beginning. One of the things that has intrigued me is Jessica Christie Sands saying recently that from, I think it's day 7, maybe day 5, when the brainstem begins to develop in utero, 7 days after conception, it is forming as a midline structure. It never becomes anything but it elaborates itself outward, but it's from this midline. And so, as you know, I've been raising this question with people on my webinar saying, okay, we need to be focusing then on the genesis of things, which is this midline. Now, just to take it out of that reality, because I don't think it's a premise, I don't think it's a theory, I think it's a reality. But to put it in one that's more familiar to people, which is relational, that development is going on. There's no attachment yet because that's going to be 2 people later on after birth. But there has to be a felt connection with the fetus and the mother, and that connectivity rests on the mother's capacity for her own regulation. And that's a whole nother conversation, but that's part of also what I learned. So I do have the feeling for myself that I was connected in utero, that happened. I happen to have been born in 1942. 1942 is the worst year in human history. Everything looked like it was going down. Hitler was winning. Britain was going to go down. I mean, it was the worst of the worst. And it was 1941 where because of Pearl Harbor, that we entered the war, because that would have well, it doesn't matter. But I was in utero, but quite developed, right, in those last 2 months. And whatever my mother was going through, I was going through too. Didn't have her thoughts, I didn't have the reference points, but her affect and her whole world was upside down. Every expectation of how she was going to live a life was now different. Was my father going to go to war? Would she lose my father? What was going to happen? Everything. And so, there's a way to be once we understand the reality of how the brain works in affect regulation and this whole electrical domain, and that she is a subject to that as I was, and I am a subject to her electrical system, and maybe even more so than she is subject to mine. And we know we can fix that or help that or ease that. That's our job, to get that word out. And that's what this book is about. That's why I wrote the book.